I think any of you that have been involved with educational work recognize the process here. You drag a whole bunch of books up on the table with you, just sort of as a security blanket, figuring that if you forget what you're supposed to do, something there might be particularly helpful. I regret I forgot to mention to Marlene that I had worked out an arrangement with the hotel that during this next half hour or so, I had hoped they could structure the sprinkler system so that if I observed people going to sleep, I could direct one or another of the house. They got confused and they weren't able to handle the job, and it went off in the opposite next door room instead. You know, I remember that gathering in Des Moines in 1985, and one of the nice things I remember about it, surprising I remember anything, but one of the nice things I remember about it was Scott Stanfield's father, Paul, was one of the hosts of that club, and I met him and was impressed with his kindness and his dedication to the work of Torch. So this is a nice remembrance with Scott delivering the paper on Thursday evening and being the editor of the magazine and that sort of thing at the moment. I've been able to meet a number of you individually in the last couple days, and I've enjoyed that opportunity. I just want to also extend my welcome and our welcome to all of you who are visiting this Torch Club in our city and our state this week. We're proud of the club and the community, and we're pleased to have you here. The Tom Carroll Torch Club has long been a mainstay of Torch International, and I'm senior enough around here to have enjoyed many years with Tom Carroll in this club, and I've been a beneficiary of his devotion to the cause. Tom would be delighted to see this gathering hosted by the Lincoln Torch Club in Lincoln this week. Of course, you've noticed that we're not bashful in Lincoln about introducing our guests to our state's noteworthy institutions and individuals. Scott got us off to a questionable start on that activity on Thursday evening with his magnificent paper on notorious killer Charles Starkweather. But after starting at the bottom like that, we've had only one direction to go, and I'm delighted to be able to focus on the opposite end of the spectrum of human qualities and achievements. Following our luncheon this noon, some of you will have the good fortune to tour our beautiful and unique state capitol. You've already observed it on the downtown horizon as you've explored our community. We are justly proud of that magnificent edifice. Within the Capitol building is the Nebraska Hall of Fame. Established in 1961, the Hall of Fame honors 25 Nebraskans who have made extraordinary contributions to the state and nation, and bronze busts of each reside in alcoves throughout the main floor of the building. All Nebraska recipients of the Congressional Medal of Honor are additional members of the Hall and are honored in a memorial room on the 14th floor of the Capitol. I'm sure you'll visit that as well. Today I want to focus on the first person to be inducted into the Hall in 1961, U.S. Senator George Norris, and the most recent nominee, or inductee, entering into the Hall last year, 2014, Alvin Johnson. I'll assume that many of you have heard of Norris, and few of you have heard of Johnson. I'll use the next 20 minutes or so to embellish the reputation of Norris and astonish you with the accomplishments of Johnson. And then, if you are on the tour of the Capitol, please seek out both of them. George Norris was born in Ohio in 1861. He served Nebraska in the House of Representatives for 10 years, and then in the Senate for 30 years. In the middle of the last century, in the 1950s, a small committee of U.S. senators was charged with the task of naming the 5 historically most outstanding senators who would then be honored by placement in 5 medallion portrait spaces in the U.S. Capitol. The selection committee relied on the judgment of an advisory panel of 160 scholars from across the country to help them make their selection. That scholarly panel put George Norris at the top of their list. But the 5 senators placed in the portrait spaces were Daniel Webster, John C. Calhoun, Henry Clay, Robert La Follette, and Robert Taft. Why Norris at number 1, but not among the honored 5? The reasons and consequences resonate down to this day. First, Norris's accomplishments. In a brief paper about 2 stalwarts, my summary will be very truncated. Norris was a person of extraordinary integrity who asserted, quote, "Government's job is to protect and ensure the well-being and happiness of its citizens," end quote. He was an advocate of economic as well as political democracy, preservation and use of natural resources for the public good, and protection of the individual against concentrations of economic and or political power. And expressing a view that most in this room would probably agree with, in discussing what he called the perils of partyism, he asserted that, quote, "of all the evils of government, the greatest is partisanship." Primary among his many accomplishments during his 40 years of service in Washington were establishment of the Tennessee Valley Authority, passage of the Norris-LaGuardia Act, ratification of the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, and reduction of the czarist authority of the Speaker of the House, who at that time was the powerful Republican Joe Cannon. Creation of the TVA was a 12-year battle, which began in 1921 when Norris led opposition to Henry Ford's attempt to lease the Muscle Shoals, Tennessee area for private development. Norris's vision was multi-purpose development of Muscle Shoals for multi-purpose public benefit. After establishment of the TVA in 1933, earlier legislation had been vetoed by Presidents Coolidge and Hoover. Norris wrote to a friend, quote, "The Tennessee Valley Authority does produce the maximum benefits which come from the proper development of an entire waterway as one system," end quote. He cited benefits of flood control, water transportation, and generation of electricity, and concluded, quote, "It represents the first attempt in history to coordinate all of these resources," end quote. He had hoped it would serve as a model for development of other river basins throughout the country. And Bob Kuzelka could talk to you at some length about those dreams and those possibilities. The Norris-LaGuardia Act, passed in 1932, was labor-friendly legislation that outlawed the yellow dog contract, in which commitment not to join a union was a requirement for employment. And Norris-LaGuardia also restricted the use of the injunction against nonviolent labor disputes. It generally created a positive right of non-interference by employers against workers joining trade unions. Note that Norris and LaGuardia were both Republicans. The 20th Amendment to the Constitution, also known as the Lame Duck Amendment, moved the beginning and ending of the terms of President and Vice President from March 4th to January 20th, and of Congress to January 3rd. This was a practical matter of great importance in implementing November electoral decisions in a more timely manner. In the inner workings of Capitol Hill, young Congressman George Norris's clever unhorsing of powerful Speaker Joe Cannon in 1910 was just the first of many ways in which Norris's actions were an affront to the leaders of his Republican Party. In his autobiography, Fighting Liberal, Norris writes, Mr. Cannon, and I'm quoting Norris, Norris writes, Mr. Cannon was probably the most articulate representative of that blighting philosophy in America which places loyalty to party at the top of the list of duties and responsibilities of citizenship. I came under his displeasure early because I would not stay hitched to his cart. End quote. As his congressional service lengthened, Norris was increasingly unreliable as a party voter, ultimately supporting Robert La Follette for president in 1924, Al Smith in 1928, and FDR in 1932. Norris was re-elected to the Senate from Nebraska in 1936 as an independent for his final term. Roosevelt campaigned for him in Nebraska that year, calling Norris, quote, the very perfect gentle knight of American progressive ideals. Republican regulars called him one of the sons of the wild jackass. And if we can return briefly to that question of why Senator Norris, placed at the top of the outstanding senator list by 160 scholars, was not included in that quintet of honorees in the U.S. Capitol, the answer lies with two of those Republican regulars, Nebraska Senators Roman Nebraska and Carl Curtis, who threatened an extensive filibuster if he was included among the honored five. Ah yes, partyism in America. Just a couple of anecdotes that sort of reinforce the tensions between George Norris and the Republican Party. Norris recounts in 1912, he was just completing his 5th term in Congress. And before he had decided what he would do with his political future, he was visited by a Nebraska lobbyist, a lobbyist from Nebraska, who was a prominent lobbyist for the liquor and the railroad industries, and who was well connected with the Nebraska Republican Party conservative interests. That lobbyist brought with him to Norris's office a satchel with $15,000 cash money, and suggested that if Norris would decide not to continue his career in Congress, but would run for governor instead, that $15,000 would be available to him and he would have no serious opposition for governor, and suggested that the campaign for governor, unopposed, would not cost more than $7,500, so the rest of the money would be his. Well, Norris knew that he was on the opposite side of several important issues from that lobbyist and his clientele, and Norris came to the conclusion, as he says in his autobiography, that they just wanted to see that I was out of Washington. They figured I could do less harm in Lincoln as governor than I could do in Washington as senator, and he decided to run for senator, ran for U.S. Senate in 1912, and that was the first of beginning of the first of 5 terms that he served there. He was a consistent and continuing thorn in the side of the Republican Party. And in 1930, after he'd completed 1912, 1824, he completed 3 terms for the Senate. The Republican establishment in Nebraska located an obscure grocer in Broken Bow, Nebraska, named George W. Norris. And they decided they would encourage Grocer Norris to run in the primary against Senator Norris for the Senate, believing that if both those names were on the ballot, the election officials would not be able to decide who was being voted for by the voters, and both names would have to be thrown out. The party establishment encouraged Grocer Norris to wait until the last minute to file. The filing deadline was apparently July 4th, and Grocer Norris waited until July 3rd to drop his nomination papers, his application to be a candidate. He waited till July 3rd to drop those into the mail. and they didn't arrive in Lincoln until July 5th because there was no delivery on the 4th of July, so they became a legal issue. The deadline was the 4th, the papers were postmarked on the 3rd, they didn't arrive till the 5th. There was this illegal entry into the primary campaign. The Republican Secretary of State, Frank Marsh, Sr., said yes, as long as the papers were postmarked on the 3rd, that was legal. The Republican Attorney General, C.A. Sorensen, said no, since they haven't arrived until July 5th, they were not legal, and the Chief Justice of the Nebraska Supreme Court, in deciding the issue, sided with Attorney General Sorensen and said the nomination was not legal and the papers would not be accepted. C.A. Sorensen, the Attorney General who sided with George Norris, Senator, was the father of Ted Sorensen, JFK's advisor, as you may remember. And when I moved to the state of Nebraska, Ted Sorensen's younger brother, Phil, was the lieutenant governor of the state. So there's a long history with the Sorensen family here. But you can see that George Norris had some rough moments with the Republican Party. After one of those Republican officials was sentenced to a jail term for the chicanery and the use of public money to try to confound that election, some of the Republican officials came to George Norris and said, don't you think it would be magnanimous if you would sign a petition to pardon that Republican regular? And George Norris said, I don't know what his exact words were, but it was essentially, hell no, he should have been sentenced to a longer sentence than he received. Well, in that light, given those conflicts and that friction, many of us Nebraskans particularly appreciate Norris's role in championing creation of our unique, nonpartisan, unicameral legislature. Implemented in 1937, largely through George Norris's efforts, we have a one-house legislature with 49 senators who are elected on a nonpartisan ballot. Yes, we know that in this red state, 35 of the current senators are registered Republicans, 13 are registered Democrats, 1 is an independent. But the legislature's committee chairs, elected by secret ballot, frequently are approximately equally divided between R's and D's. And avoiding the scourge of party discipline, just last month, that nonpartisan legislature provided at least 30 votes to override 3 significant vetoes issued by our Republican Governor, Pete Ricketts. Those 3 vetoes had been on bills to abolish the death penalty, permit issuing driver's licenses to children of undocumented immigrants, and increasing the state's gasoline tax. Senator Norris would have appreciated the fruits of his labors. I wish his nonpartisan impact were more widespread. Turning from the first inductee into the Nebraska Hall of Fame, I want to introduce the most recent honoree, Alvin Saunders Johnson. As his Hall of Fame plaque proclaims, Johnson was a humanitarian, educator, economist of extraordinary accomplishments. Johnson was born in northeast Nebraska in 1874 to Danish immigrant parents. His father, Jens Jensen Dayrup, had encountered a U.S. immigration officer in 1849 who asserted that there was no such name as Dayrup and rechristened him John Johnson. A farm kid, Alvin was basically homeschooled by his remarkable mother and a bookish uncle. In his wonderful autobiography, Pioneer's Progress, Johnson writes, quote, "With gratitude I acknowledge that my early schooling interfered very little with my education." After helping with the family farm in 1893, Johnson traveled to Lincoln, and although quite late for the start of fall classes at the university, He marched to the Chancellor's office and persuaded Chancellor James Canfield to allow him to try to catch up. Canfield did, and Johnson did, and 5 years later he had completed his master's degree in classics and had been offered a contract to co-author a comparative grammar of Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and Gothic. I guess he had not been plagued by the distractions of iPods and texting during his college experience. That was an amazing period at the University of Nebraska. Among Johnson's classmates when he was an undergraduate here were Willa Cather, Hartley Burr Alexander. You received this very interesting booklet about Hartley Burr Alexander, and you will see his work throughout the Capitol today if you visit the Capitol. One of the instructors that Johnson encountered, and he has some humorous discussions of those encounters in his autobiography, was Lieutenant John J. Pershing, who was the instructor in the ROTC program here at the time. But being a clever lad, even though he had that book contract in hand, Johnson decided that his future would be brighter if he pursued a less esoteric discipline, and he headed off to Columbia University to pursue a PhD in economics, actually in political economy. As an economist myself, I appreciate that academic choice, and I admire his teaching career in economics at Bryn Mawr, Columbia, the University of Nebraska, the University of Texas, the University of Chicago, Stanford, Cornell, and Yale. He also authored the standard economics textbook of the early 20th century, which left teachers complaining that it presented the subject matter so well that it left nothing for them to discuss. He was honored by election to the presidency of the American Economic Association in 1936, a fact he omits from his 450-page autobiography. But he obviously was restless as an academic economist and frustrated by what he perceived as lack of success at making long-term changes in the intellectual outlook of undergraduates. Some of you perhaps can identify with that. Deciding then to educate the educated, he joined Charles Beard, Thorsten Veblen, and John Dewey, among others, in founding the New School for Social Research in New York City. Johnson soon became director of the New School, and he served in that capacity from 1922 through 1945. This was a pioneering effort in adult education featuring courses taught by prominent intellectuals, including Franz Boas, Harold Lasky, Bertrand Russell, and Louis Mumford. Beyond the social sciences, the New School developed the respected dramatic workshop and the Parsons School for Design, as well as other innovative programs. Perhaps Johnson's greatest contribution at the New School was his creation and support for what was called the University in Exile, which was a vehicle for providing a safe haven and academic home for at least 183 European scholars and intellectuals fleeing Nazism between 1933 and 1945. Included among those immigrants were luminaries such as Paul Baran, Gerhard Kohl, Mario Einaudi, George Katona, Emil Lederer, Claude Levi-Strauss, Rudolf Litauer, Adolf Lowe, Bronislaw Malinowski, Jacob Marshak, Franco Modigliani, Hans Staudinger, Leo Strauss, and George Zell. That's 14 names. I can give myself a headache trying to imagine the span of cultural and scholarly contributions by those 183 scholars and their intellectual descendants. Just another little anecdote. This is really a short paper, so I can tell a couple of stories. One of those names I just read was Gerhard Kohl, C-O-L-M. Kohl was an economist. He served President Roosevelt and President Truman as an economic advisor. I've got a list of his various titles here somewhere. Combe was chief economist for the Council of Economic Advisors. He was principal fiscal analyst for the Bureau of the Budget. He was director of the National Planning Association. And in 1962, when I was working in Washington, D.C. during the daytime and taking courses at night from George Washington University, Gerhard Combe was also moonlighting as a faculty member at George Washington, and when I walked into a public finance class one evening, my instructor was Gerhard Combe. I didn't know anything about Gerhard Combe, I didn't know anything about Alvin Johnson, but when working on Johnson's nomination into the Nebraska Hall of Fame, I encountered that connection and was impressed by the coincidence. Klaus Combe, Gerhard's youngest son, wrote a very moving letter in support of Alvin Johnson's nomination to the Nebraska Hall of Fame 2 years ago, and recounted the fact that he would not be alive, his family would not have existed if it were not for Alvin Johnson. And Klaus Combe noted that their family physician for many years was Natalie Daru, who was Alvin Johnson's daughter. So it's some interesting connections. Coincidentally, Bob Kerrey, former Nebraska governor and U.S. senator, also served as president of the New School for a decade earlier in this century. And speaking at the ceremony placing Johnson in the Nebraska Hall of Fame, of which Kerry is also a member by virtue of his Medal of Honor, Kerry assured us that Johnson's work raising money to bring Jewish scholars to the new school in the 1930s was not popular with the school's board of trustees. That episode is another profile in courage. George Norris had been one of 8 profiles included in John Kennedy's book with that title. Recognizing his work in adult education, the American Association for Adult Education elected Johnson as its president in 1939, also not mentioned in his autobiography. In keeping with his interest in educating the educated, Johnson was also an active editor and public intellectual. He did editorial work for the New Republic, Social Research, Political Science Quarterly, and Yale Review. He was the managing editor of the initial Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences, which when it was first published in 1937 was called the United States' Most Distinguished Contribution to International Scholarship. And of course, Johnson's editorial work on the encyclopedia was what put him in touch with many of Europe's leading scholars, whom he then brought to this country as part of the university in exile. But there is still more to Alvin Johnson's story. In 1943, aware of discrimination against African American veterans returning from World War II, Johnson had written, quote, "Race discrimination is the greatest potential menace to our democracy." New York Governor Thomas Dewey, noting Johnson's many achievements, asked him to chair a commission to investigate and promote remedies for discrimination in employment in plants that had enjoyed war contracts. Johnson agreed with the stipulation that his charge be expanded to deal with discrimination in all fields of activity, employment, housing, education, and healthcare. And in 1945, Governor Dewey signed into law the Ives-Quinn Act, the product of Johnson's handiwork. Let me share a bit of Alvin Johnson's letter to Tom Dewey's chief of staff after Johnson had been offered the chairmanship of this commission. He was offered the chairmanship of the commission to eliminate discrimination in industries that have war contracts. Johnson's letter, in part, said, "Now, I'll tell you what I want. I want the committee placed under the executive. I want a definite 3-year tenure. I want to get rid of the limitation to industrial establishments having war contracts. I want the power to go into all forms of discrimination in hospitals, schools, housing, etc. I want the power to employ counsel, to hold hearings, to subpoena witnesses, to issue reports. I want money. Give me power and money, and I will do a real job that will assure the governor that the race problem in New York will be taken care of systematically, rationally, unobtrusively. If the state is too damn poor to take care of its vital interests, I'd be willing to go out and raise a good part of the money from private sources. But if it's not possible to create a real setup, and if we have to go on with the bastard and fugitive setup created by Governor Lehman in one of his less good moments, I do strongly advise the abolition of the committee. Johnson got his power. That was a Nebraska kid. Johnson got his power and his money, and Ives Quinn was the first anti-discrimination legislation passed in the United States and became the model for the United States Civil Rights Act of 1964. It has been reported that when Branch Rickey, president and GM of the Brooklyn Dodgers, heard of the passage of the New York legislation, he told his wife, "They can't stop me now." He signed Jackie Robinson to a minor league contract. Perhaps that's enough. There's more I could relate concerning Johnson's work with the Carnegie Library Commission or the Bureau of Reclamation or with experimental agricultural communities, but you would soon stop believing me. I'll just conclude my tribute to Johnson by reporting that he also, in his spare time, authored 2 well-received novels, 3 collections of short stories, and the magnificent autobiography that I have mentioned. Well, that's enough blather for a Saturday morning, and as I promised myself, it still is Saturday morning. The theme of this Torch Convention is Great Plains, Great Ideas. I hope I've demonstrated that that's not just a slogan, but is a reality. Each of us, to one degree or another, benefits from some of those great ideas. And for those of you about to tour the state capitol, I'm glad to have provided a bit more introduction to George Norris and Alvin Johnson, 2 of those Hall of Fame figures that you will encounter. Thank you.